Hello. Thank you for having me. This is very funereal in here, isn't it? I love it. Hey, Landis.
Hey, Caitlin.
This is a recurring series we have called Pulpit to Pulpit.
I am quite nervous, but I don't know how you do this all the time, Caitlin, but we'll give it our best shot here. In order to write From Here to Eternity, I know you traveled all around the world researching various death customs that most Americans have never even heard of before, and I'm curious what was the original inspiration for this idea?
All right, do we want the long version or the short version? We'll do the medium version. So, I have always been really interested in death customs around the world. How do I sound in the back? I'm okay? Yeah, it's my pulpit. I'd always been really interested. I remember when I graduated from college right here in Chicago. Woo! Not Northwestern, though, where we are today. University of Chicago, sorry. Boo, yay. So I graduated and I was able to spend several months traveling around Europe, and I always wanted to go to the destinations, as I call them, you know, mummified monk fingers and bodies under chapels, etc. And I used this book called Macabre Europe. And I don't think it's still in print, but I remember using this book and thinking, it's someone's job to go around and find all of these interesting death spots. Maybe that will be me someday. No, it couldn't be. And then the real story is that, fast forward to 2011, I had just opened or started my web series, Ask a Mortician.
Yes, I remember.
And if you remember anything else about that era, it was also the era of the weird job, wacky job reality TV show. So if you were a children's dance instructor or an ice road trucker, you would get your own reality show. So when I showed up as a sort of camera-ready mortician, it was like chum was in the water. They were really excited to have me do a TV show, but don't get too excited because most of the concepts were like, okay, we're gonna have you in a hearse, and you're gonna drive to pick up a date, and you and your date are going to go to a cemetery or an asylum, and you're gonna hunt for ghosts together on your date. And if you both can handle it, then you get another date or something. So I wasn't gonna do any of that by any stretch of the imagination, but then I got an email from a very prestigious network that you've heard of, that I grew up knowing, and they asked me what I could do if I could do anything. What kind of show would I want to do? And I thought back to my travels and my long-term interest, and I said, what if we went around the world looking at different death customs? And to my surprise, they agreed. And at first, the head of the network was not sure about the whole death thing, which is understandable. It's corpses on primetime TV. But we shot a whole pilot at the Temple of Santa Muerte in Los Angeles, and I thought it went really well, and it goes to the head of the network, and I get a call from the producer, and he says, okay, he's gotten over the whole death thing, but he knows that when it comes down to it, no one is gonna watch a show like this hosted by a woman.
Oof. Wow.
Oh, thank you for that reaction. We're so used to living in this world, it's kind of like, yeah, well, that sounds right. So originally they tried to find me a male co-host for the event. I don't know if it was like, oh, you've had a long day of shooting and he's just gonna prop you up with his penis or something. Unclear what he would be there for, as I was the expert, but we did that, and I obviously had to back out at that point, and I thought that I would never get to do this and it wouldn't happen. And then when Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, my first book came out, and it did well, my editor said, what's your next book? And I said, there is no next book. That was the book, you got the book, yay. And he said, no, let's dig deep. And I thought back to all these experiences, and now I have all of this new experience being an advocate and running my own funeral home, and I knew that I could bring something special that I hadn't even thought of before to this new book. And here we are.
Well, After all that, then are you glad it's a second book rather than a television show? Or?
Oh yeah, I
Okay.
should make that clear. I'm very glad
Okay.
for multiple reasons. One is that there's a lot made of the lack of diversity in the publishing industry, and that's very true and something that needs to be addressed early and often. But I will say that my editor never had a problem with me being a woman and writing this book, as he knew that I was the expert and not someone who needed a male co-writer. I did get a male illustrator. But you are the expert on that, so great. I also will say that looking back now, the thought of going into the places that I went, these really intimate scenarios where someone has just died, and having a whole team of American dude bros with cameras following me and being like, hey, heard your dad died, that sucks. You know, it just doesn't, it feels like I wouldn't have gotten the stories that I ended up getting in this scenario.
Okay. Well, then I'm wondering, why did you end up choosing to have illustrations in the book? I mean, did you consider having photos instead? If you were going from trying to show people this access to something that they hadn't seen before, wouldn't photos have been a more direct...
Are you trying to nag your own illustrations here? This is very Landis to be like,
Oh, I'm so humble. You just shouldn't have had illustrations at all.
no, I think I had a guy, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Vice, the magazine and platform Vice, but one of the first interviews I did for the book was with them, and they asked me, the guy was like, I could have handled real photos, I wanted to see the real mummies and the decomposing bodies, and yeah, a lot of people are interested in photographs like that, but this is also a book for everyone. And I want people to read this book who are possibly terrified of their own death and terrified of their own mortality. And if you open a book that's just full of pictures that are very confronting, it might be too much for the general audience. And I think the idea of artistically rendering these experiences, so they're still visual and it's still a visual treat and it's still beautiful, can actually make the harder, grosser parts of the book easier to take because there are these elegant illustrations with them. I don't know, are you getting positive feedback so far?
It's been mostly positive, which...
Wait, have you gotten any negative feedback? Has anyone like sent you a tweet that's...
No, not exactly, but I was doing a different illustration style than I typically work with, so it was kind of, I mean, I still feel insecure about them in some sense, so it's been very encouraging seeing people react to them, but I confess when you first asked me to do this, and you were explaining that you wanted illustrations for your book, I wasn't understanding why you would want illustrations. I had a very hard time until we got near the beginning, and so it's encouraging to see that it has been received in the way that, so it was your vision, obviously, that led to that, because I would have said early on, no, you don't need illustrations, so.
Of course, it was my vision. Thank you, Landis. I saw talent in you when no one else saw it. This is not true. Not true.
Okay. Well, next question. How did you end up choosing which countries you were going to visit, and were there countries and or death customs that you wanted to experience or witness but you weren't able to for some reason?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are 195 countries, and I could have spent the rest of my life traveling around to each of them, and I may still do that, just crowdfund myself and do that. But I wanted places that I knew that I would have a respectful access to these interesting things. I wanted it to be places where the average journalist or tourist couldn't go. For example, in Bali, they do this thing where when rulers die, they put their bodies in a giant jeweled bowl, like a 2-story bowl encrusted with jewels, and they roll the giant bowl through the streets. And at the end of the parade, they set the whole thing on fire to cremate the bodies inside, so it's like a Burning Man with a giant bowl. And I thought that was incredibly cool, but anybody can show up for that, and I didn't have this specialized access or know people there. So it would have been just a tourist story, really, as opposed to an intimate story. And there's actually, yesterday in Thailand, their president died a year ago, and they have a year of mourning until they have the cremation. And the cremation in this case is like a several day long thing where over 1 million people show up, and they're all wearing black, and there's this massive cremation. And I said, no, I have the Chicago Humanities Festival, so I cannot go. I told the people I would be there, so. But yeah, there's so many interesting things that happen, but it had to be, to go in the book, it had to be a special story. It had to either be a family that was really interesting, it had to be a custom that I knew that, again, I could show up and not be like, hey, heard your dad died, yoinks. And it was about knowing people either through the Order of the Good Death, the group that I run, or knowing people just through the death scene, which there is one. But I will say, people will say to me all the time, have you heard of this mushroom burial suit? Or have you heard of this body composting? And it's very sweet that they ask that, but it's also like, yes, there's like 12 of us who do this work. We all know each other very well. But that kind of close relationship means that I was able to go and see these things, again, that the average person wouldn't have access to. And that's how I ended up choosing where I went for the book.
Do you mind talking at all about the idea of death tourism? And because that was something I was intrigued with in reading through the book was, I mean, and you're being humorous with it and making fun of yourself I'm thinking of the passage when you're standing in the cave in Indonesia and it's dark, and then tourists come upon you and they're Instagramming photos of you because you're more interesting than the skulls.
Well, I don't know that I was more interesting than the skulls. I think I was just...
You're out of place. But I mean, I guess I'm curious how you because there definitely were elements of tourism in the travels that you did, and yet I felt like you did a good job of balancing that. And I guess, are you worried that people are going to then go and seek out these villages in Indonesia that, I mean, there already are some, but are you gonna...
That's a great question. There's no way to write a book about going to different countries and searching out stories without talking about tourism and death tourism. And I always go back and forth on this because on one hand, I believe that it's really meaningful to go see other places and see other cultures and learn from them, especially when in our own culture, we're kept so far from death. We're kept so distant from death. So being able to actually show up and see a real dead body or see a real culture or see a real ritual is so refreshing. But on the other hand, you don't want to stumble into someone's private funeral ceremony. Yeah. And the place that I really ran into this was in Indonesia. And in this specific rural area of Indonesia called Tanah Toraja, they've really developed this whole death tourism. And they did it intentionally. They have these elaborate funerals and death rituals, and they realized people were going to come. They didn't have the beaches of Bali or these other parts of Indonesia that are really tourist heavy, so they knew how to get butts in the seats was to invite people to see these elaborate funeral rituals. And so you go to someone's funeral there, and it's mostly Indonesian people, and then there's this little section of Dutch and German tourists to the side, and some of them are just sitting there respectfully, and some are, there was one German woman who just had her iPad, and she was just walking through the crowd like a bull is being sacrificed over here, and children are running around in costumes, and she's just smoking her Marlboro Red and putting her iPad in children's faces. And they kept announcing, would the tourists please go back to their section? And I wanted to just be like, lady, come back. On behalf of white people around the world, please just get back to the section. But something else that's sort of interesting to think about here is that in Indonesia is huge, by the way. It's the 4th most populous country in the world, which I actually didn't know before going there, embarrassingly. And so they have all these different islands, all of these different cultures, and they have people who visit Tanah Toraja who live in big cosmopolitan cities in other areas of Indonesia. So the tourism is largely from other places in Indonesia, and they treat these quote-unquote weird funeral customs like we would treat, the people who charm snakes in religions in Appalachia, or, that's sort of something that we consider an othered custom. So they visit because they want to see these strange things too. And the story you're referring to is when I first got to Indonesia and I had flown for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of my life that I will never get back. And I show up and I'm almost crazed with lack of sleep. And I go into this cave where they have it set up there where there are coffins that they put along a mountainside, and the coffins decompose, the wood decomposes, and the bones come tumbling down the hill out of the coffins, and then they collect the skulls and the bones and they put them in this cave, sort of a family cave of bones. And there's a couple that you can visit. And I'm in there alone with my companion, and he's very, very adventurous, so he goes crawling off through this tiny little hole in one of the cave walls on his stomach. And I'm thinking to myself, ooh, I'm not doing that. Not today, I'm already hallucinating a little bit. Not doing that. Not getting trapped in a rural Indonesian cave today with these hips, nope. So I'm there and I'm just alone in the dark, surrounded by skulls, and this Indonesian family, a mom and some teenagers from, the main Jakarta, the main cities, comes in, and they light up the cave with their cell phones, and the young man comes up to me and says, "Excuse me, ma'am, we will take a selfie? We will take an Instagram?" And this beautiful, cordial English was like, we will create an Instagram, is what he said. And I was like, what's going on? Okay. So somewhere I'm in these selfies in a skull cave with some Indonesian tourists. They didn't ask me what I was doing there. They were just like, yep, here she is. We found this strange, tired girl in a black cave. Time to take a picture. So yeah, you have to, my editor in the end made me cut a lot of stuff about tourism because it was kind of just me ruminating on my own place in this cycle, and he was like, nobody wants to hear that, just back to the corpses, ixnay.
Okay, well, then maybe let's talk about a different, well, actually you have a reading I think you prepared for us from the chapter on Japan, which is quite different from Indonesia.
Quite different from Indonesia. This is a 180 from that. All right. A reading from the book From Here to Eternity by me, Caitlin Doughty. The Buddhist temple, a 17th century building tucked away off a quiet street in Tokyo, is home to a modest cemetery with aged headstones representing generations of families that have come to worship here. Yajima Jushoku means head priest or monk, emerged to greet me, an affable man in a brown robe with close-cropped white hair and glasses. In contrast to his archaic surroundings, Yajima Jushoku is a man of new ideas, specifically how to memorialize cremated remains, my kind of guy. When the temple reached capacity, the priest Yajima could have invested in old-fashioned cemetery space. Instead, 7 years ago, he built the Ruriden Columbarium. Columbaria are separate buildings for storing cremated remains. Buddhism has always been state-of-the-art, he explained. It's quite natural to use technology alongside Buddhism. I see no conflict at all. With that, he showed me through the doors of the complex's newest hexagonal building. I stood in the darkness while Yajima punched something into the keypad at the entrance. Moments later, 2,000 floor-to-ceiling Buddhas began to glow and pulse a vivid blue. What? I bleated, stunned and delighted. I had seen photographs of Ruriden, but to be surrounded 360 degrees by luminous Buddhas was overwhelming. Yajima opened a locked door and I peeked behind the Buddha walls at 600 sets of bones. Labeled to make it easy to find Miss Kubota-san, he smiled. Each set of cremated remains corresponded to a crystal Buddha on the wall. When a family member comes to visit Ruridan, they either type in the name of the deceased or pull out a smart card with a chip, similar to cards used on Tokyo's subways. After the family keys in at the entrance, the walls light up blue, except for one single Buddha shimmering clear white. No need to squint through names trying to find Mom. The white light will guide you straight to her. Yajima headed back to the keypad controller and instructed me to stand in the center of the room. "The autumn scene," he announced, and the formation of Buddhas turned yellow and brown with shifting patches of red like piles of freshly fallen leaves. "Winter scene," and the Buddhas turned to snowdrifts of light blue and white. "Shooting star," and the Buddhas turned purple as white spots jumped from Buddha to Buddha like a stop-motion animation of the night sky. This LED light show could have been a Disney production, but there was something in the sophisticated design of the lights that made it feel as though I was being swaddled in a Technicolor womb. Yajima invited me for tea inside the temple and offered me a stool brought out for visiting foreigners. He believed I couldn't endure sitting cross-legged on the floor mats for the duration of tea and conversation. I assured him I absolutely could. I couldn't. My legs fell painfully asleep within the first 3 minutes. I asked Yajima why he had designed Ruridan the way he did, and his response was impassioned. "The family is supposed to look after your grave, but we don't have enough people to look after everyone's grave. We had to do something for the people left behind." Each morning, Yajima enters Ruridan and punches in the day's date. That morning he punched in May 13th. Several Buddhas glowed yellow, representing the people who had died on that day. Yajima lit incense and prayed for them. He remembers them, even if there's no family left to do so. For an elderly man or woman with no remaining family, the glowing Buddhas at Ruridan will act as their afterlife community. Yajima Jushoku may be a powerful priest, but he's also a designer. When I pray, I also think about creating. How do we create something new filled with dazzling light? How do we create new Buddhas? For him, the act of prayer is essential to creativity. Every time I pray, the different ideas pop up. I'm not a man who sits at a desk to create a plan. It's all while I'm praying. And what if Ruridan fills up with ashes? If it fills up, then I'll consider a second or third. Yajima smiled. I'm already thinking of them.
Oh, thank you. That's, Is the United States really ready for something like that? or what hurdles do we have to overcome here in order to allow ourselves to be creative with technology like that they are there? I mean, around death care?
Is the United States ready for a light-up Buddha columbarium? I don't know. But I think we're ready for our version of that.
Okay.
And what I loved about Japan especially is that when you talk about Indonesia and this rural area, it's easy to dismiss it. It's easy to say, oh, these are people in the non-developed world, and I wouldn't do this, but it's easy to say that if you're someone in the US. But in Japan, they're a highly technologically evolved country that's very urban, and they not only hang out with the dead body and interact with the dead body, they then have all of these really cool, innovative, technologically advanced things that can happen to the body after that. And those are the two things that the United States is really missing, I think.
That sounds great. Okay, I'm not gonna ask you the question that I've heard asked of you over and over again. Why are there so many women in the death positive movement? But I know this to be true from my own experience in that when I attend an Order of the Good Death meeting, I'm frequently the only male there. And I'm wondering if you could explain what you mean in your book when you talk about women around the world using death as a means to retake charge of their bodies again.
Oh, that's great. There's actually pretty good male representation in the crowd today. I don't know if you're Chicago Humanities people or death people, but we welcome men as well. Hello, welcome. Yeah, it has the movement. So by the way, for those of you not familiar with the death positive movement, what that means, it doesn't mean, oh, mom died, yay! It means that it's okay and not morbid to be interested in this conversation about death. And if you're here today, most of you already are familiar with that and feel that way, that it's okay to be interested in the history and the culture and the art of death. But that's what death positive means, and it is largely a female movement so far. And I have my own reasons for that, or I think I have my own reasons for that. But around the world, you do also see this happening. One example would be in Bolivia. In Bolivia, I visited this festival called the Festival of the Natitas. And what a natita is a skull, but it's a special skull. And it's a special skull because it has the power, they believe that it have the power to help, that they have a connection with the beyond, and that you can get help in love or in finances or in your family issues from these special skulls. And the people who keep them, especially the people who keep a lot of them in their house, are usually women. And what I found eventually so amazing about this is this part of Bolivia, it's very, very Catholic. But what these women are doing is almost saying, and they're not explicit about this, but what I perceive to be happening is they're taking the power away from the male priest to be the only connection that the people have to the beyond. And saying, okay, if you're not comfortable just telling your male priest all of your domestic issues, you can come to my ñatitas, my wall of ñatitas, and I will tell you which one specializes in the problem you're having. So there was one incredible ñatita named Sandra, who was really more of a mummified head than a skull, and beautifully preserved with thick white braids. And what I loved about Sandra is that her specialty was business, which I thought was very feminist. So if you have a business issue, you can come and bring offerings directly to Sandra the ñatita and bring it to her, and it's almost a way of skipping over the Catholic Church's dominance to the beyond, and their comfort with death, and these skulls is what allows them to do that. And then another example would be in North Carolina, where they're doing experiments at what we'd call a body farm or a human decomposition facility to compost dead bodies. And I think a lot of women are specifically interested in the idea of allowing our bodies to decompose. And I haven't fully teased out all the reasons yet, but I think it has to do with our funeral industry in America is very interested in control of the body. They want to take your body immediately, they want to chemically preserve it, and they want to present it back to you in a highly controlled environment. No little bit of seepage out of the nose or mouth, no noises, no smells, no anything that indicates that this person is actively a dead body or actively decomposing in any way. And this has been a pretty corporatized, male-run industry for the last 100 years. And I think I just get to decompose into the earth. Like, how chill does that sound? I love it. Sign me up. And I think that the women who are working on this composting project specifically share that idea. They share that desire to be allowed to just return to nature, even if it's messy.
Okay. We are running out of time, but before I turn it over to the audience, I'm going to ask a slightly selfish question that dovetails with something you were just talking about there regarding women being able to go past the hierarchy of the church. I mean, I guess from the pulpit here. Good place to ask this, but as you know, I grew up in an extremely religious household and have since left that faith, and with it, any sense of spirituality I had around death. And I'm wondering, in reading your book, it doesn't seem like your view of death care itself changed at all, but, kind of on what you were just talking about there, can you talk at all about how your belief in spirituality around death has been impacted by what you saw, in all the different countries you went to?
Yeah, I don't know that I'm a pretty secular person, full disclosure. Yeah, I'm preaching secularism from my pulpit today. But what I will say, that something that's been in my work from the beginning and something that's even stronger as I go along is the idea that even if you don't have a religion, you still need ritual when someone dies. So ritual remains important even if it's divorced from religion or spirituality. So, for example, there was this town that I visited, a small town in Colorado called Crestone, and then they have the only public open-air pyre in America. And they allow all religions to use the pyre. It's totally open to anyone in that community. And when I stood there and the woman was laid on the pyre and she was set alight by her family members, and the smoke, the white smoke starts to twirl into the air and the flames start to rise, like, gosh darn if that wasn't a spiritual, religious experience, because you're there before your eyes and someone is transforming in this physical way. And it was ritual if I ever saw it. And that's another thing that is wildly missing from our American death customs. And something that I saw all around the world consistently, whether it was in the glowing circle of the Buddhas in Japan, whether it's Dias de los Muertos in Mexico, where they have the cemetery that's just glowing with candles and music and fires burning and family and food, and it's in this boundary of the cemetery, or in the walls of this open-air pyre cremation. It's this idea of holding people in and holding the space and creating this safe space for people to come in and feel whatever they want to feel around death. They can have a spiritual moment, a moment of despair, a moment of transition, whatever comes up for them. We need to be creating spaces as funeral directors, as people who work in death in America. We need to be creating these spaces for people that hold them in and say, come in and feel safe to feel however you want to feel. And I maintain that the American funeral industry, when you have a wake, where you just kind of have to file by the dead body and tap its hand, we're not providing that for people the way that we need to. And that's the number one, if we're looking around the world, that's the number one thing that we can take and bring back to our own society to improve ourselves.
Thank you very
Preach.
much, Caitlin.
Yeah. And that's what I have to say about that.
Okay, I think we're going to turn it over to questions from the audience now.
Oh, great.
And someone that has a microphone, they're going to be circulating.
Yeah, I love an audience question. Doesn't have to be about anything we talked about. Any corpse questions you have about your own body, bodies of others?
Great, so if everyone raise their hands if they do have a question, and we will point you out, and when it gets to be your turn, if you could just stand.
Hi.
Hi. So in your videos and books, you often talk about the importance of being able to view the body in extensive periods of time, not only so we can look at the body and say, that's going to be me someday, but also look at it and say, that's my mother, that's my family member, what have you. This person is going to be gone, no longer part of my life, and start that process.
Oh, you got my talking points down. You're perfect. You need to go on the road with me.
Has that always been specifically in consideration to America and the Western world and the cultures that kind of shield us from the body? Or if it was originally more of a general idea, how did it shift when you were witnessing rituals that kept the body and corpse around for extensive periods of time? Not only that, but viewed them on some level as still cognizant on some level, some plane, while also allowing the practitioner, the mourner, what have you, to look at it and say, this is going to be me someday.
Whew. There's a lot going on there. I love that question. I'm not gonna answer that 45 minutes long, although I could. I'll spare everyone here. But I think probably what you're referring to is the idea of like these mummified corpses in Indonesia that stay for a very long time in the home. And of course, there are other cultures that do this as well. And something that's been coming up a lot is the vast chasm between the idea of the American funeral that becomes an emergency the second someone dies, and it's like, oh my God, someone has died, get him out, it's an emergency, take the corpse away, now. And then something like Indonesia, where when someone dies, they don't even consider the person really dead. They consider them to have a high fever and still be aware of what's going on, and then they mummify the body and keep them in the home, sometimes for years. And so, like, how do we get the same human race to have such vastly different ends of the spectrum? And we can look at our system and say it's a little unhealthy that we're so afraid of the dead body, but also isn't it unhealthy that they're so connected to the dead body? And I'll say from being there, I didn't really get any sort of pathological sense from their culture and being around the dead body. Even when they brought out the mummies years later, there's some contention that, oh, isn't that delayed grief? Why are you still bringing out mom's mummified body and showing her new babies and, you know, changing her clothes 7 years later? Isn't that you just being obsessed with this dead person? And I don't really think so. I don't think so because when they brought out, say, the patriarch of the family, brought out his mummy, the women would come over and they would cry over him. But I didn't get a sense that they did that every day. This was a special festival, this was a special time where Dad came out, and it was their time to see him and interact with him. And it was an acknowledgement that we don't particularly do well here, that the grief never goes away. If it's someone you love, if it's your husband, if it's your father, that grief never stops. And they're glad to see him. They're glad to see Dad, and they're sad to see Dad, but they're not obsessing over it every day or obsessed with the death. They're just glad to have this reintroduction to the mummified remains. And obviously they have a really different idea of what the mummy represents than we would, which would be like, Norman Bates, psycho, mom's mummy. So yeah, there's a lot to that question, but I think ultimately we have to let cultures do what makes sense for them. And I think what we do doesn't make sense for us. And most people feel it. Most people get that the American funeral industry doesn't make sense quite for us. Mummification and taking the body out years later doesn't make sense for us either. But what we're doing in the emergency and the whole thing doesn't make sense for us, and that there is a better way to do it. So I'll cut it off there, but I'll write an essay to you later and send it to your inbox. Oh, way in the back. Good job. Hi.
Hi, Caitlin. So I'm studying to become a funeral director because of your videos. Awesome. But my question is, how do we as like young funeral directors counteract this like SCI, dignity memorials culture that we're living in, and how do we try to get more death positive? Because right now I'm in a lot of online forums and it is run by a lot of older white men. They do have a lot of negative views on you and your ideas.
What?
And I'm kind of, I know, shocking, shocking. And I'm in the same boat as you. So how would you encourage young funeral directors to kind of take this by the horns?
Well, we wait for them to die. No, I'm kidding. Yeah. Sorry, older men in the audience, not intended to you. Yes, there's a lot of things that we can do. First is, I think it's important that you're considering actually entering the industry at this stage. And it's gonna be the hardest right now. It's gonna be the hardest that it's ever gonna be, because there was this moment about 2 or 3 years ago when we're starting to introduce these things and they don't even know what we're talking about, and they're like, I don't know about this. Maybe you could tell me more about a home funeral, about a natural burial. I don't know about that. But we're now at a place where they all have seen on their Facebook, they've seen some article about me, they've seen some article about a home funeral, and they're now like, what is this hippie bullshit? And so now they're angry about it, and they're digging even deeper into their traditional funeral model of the embalming and the hearse and the flowers and the makeup and the suit and the whole thing. And so you have to be in there, in the trenches, even if it's not a wonderful, welcoming environment for you, and you'll find some allies there, and you'll find some not allies, and you have to just kind of suck it up and believe in what you're there for and keep doing it, because it is changing. More and more people exactly like you are entering the industry, and they're having an effect. And you know, you can also say to your eventual boss, you can say, I know that you think that a family interacting with the body or helping to dress mom or having a natural funeral somewhere or a natural burial somewhere is all this hippie myth. But why don't we just agree that if some family comes in and inquires about it, that you send them to me? And then I'll take care of them. I promise I'll still get their money for something or whatever you need to make you comfortable, but I'll handle them, and I'll make sure that they like our funeral home because I'm giving them what they actually want.
Hi. So just a quick question. My husband is a funeral director. He wanted to be here, but he had to run a service today. And for me, whenever I tell people what he does, or I'm in nursing school, so I'm in the hospital, whenever people die, people have this weird like aversion to it. And it's almost, people will almost say things that are kind of borderline insulting about like, oh, dead body, oh, they don't even want to be near it. And so I guess as far as being death positive, how would you go about trying to educate people who just kind of had this immediate aversion and like grossed out reaction even when you just talk about death?
Yeah, that's a great question. That, I have to say, that really rarely happens to me because I think that I'm coming at it with this attitude of I will not accept under any circumstances you to besmirch the good name of a corpse. So I have this attitude of like, hey, ask me anything you want. Hi. And they just don't do it to me, but I understand, I get that all the time, that people say it happens to them. And I think what I would say is if you are so freaked out by the dead body and you're freaked out by death, you're not the weird one for being able to have the conversation. They're the one who can't have the conversation. You're not morbid for being open about this. Our creepy death denial, makeup on the corpse society, that's a little more morbid than your open conversation about it. So first of all, have that core of belief in yourself that you're on the right side of history. And second, ask them some questions. If you're, throw it back on them. If you say, yeah, I work in the hospital, often in the morgue, interestingly, my partner's a funeral director, how about that? And if they go, oh my God, how do you do that? How do you work with dead bodies? Just say, wow, that's a really strong reaction. What gave you that fear of dead bodies? Yeah, where does that come from? Do you think that's a cultural thing for you? Why are you having that reaction? Wow, yeah, that's heavy. Oh, you did have that really negative experience. Why don't I recommend some things for you to not feel that way? Because I don't want you to feel that way. Gosh, that must be terrible to go through life with that kind of weird negative relationship with death. Let me help you out. Just slide them a pamphlet across the table. Yeah, I think just remember that you're not weird for feeling that way. And you're actually, again, like I was saying to the woman in the back, you're the person in your community who is this resource and is this bright light of knowledge and comfort with death. And be confident in that and happy that you're that person and proud that you're that person.
Shocked when you say that you would like to have your body decompose when you're dead. What shocked me, not your desire of this or whatever, but that it's some contradiction, because when your body after your death, it's not you anymore. You cannot say this, it's just something. And this is why I ask more general question. If you visit your dead relative in the cemetery for some reasons, does it make any sense that you can have the same connection in your room? If you imagine, so is it really death is absence of existence? And you cannot codify it by some kind of rituals or something. It's just nothing. And therefore you cannot really make this visits or whatever. If you're really secular, as you say, they don't make any sense.
Oh, that's a great question. I will also not, did everybody get that in the back? Okay, so I believe that what you're asking is saying if I am secular, as I claim to be, is not the person dead and gone forever when the moment of death happens? Why am I saying we should sit with the body? Why am I saying that we should visit the grave and continue to mourning and to continue to mourn if in fact they are gone? This is another 50-minute speech that I could give, but I will try and condense it down. I know you're the last question. Here's the thing. I don't believe, people say that to me a lot. People say, you know what, doesn't matter what happens to me when I'm dead, doesn't matter what happens to my body, just throw me in the dumpster for all I care, I'm dead. I don't really believe them. I'm not saying I don't believe you, but I don't believe people who say that it doesn't matter at all what happens to their body. Because what I've found is that people who have really faced down death and really faced down mortality tend to have this profound respect for death and this profound, not fear of it, but understanding of it as this great, powerful force in our life. So I'm someone who believes, like Ernest Becker, that the Grim Reaper has his hand up all of our butts and puppets us around, and the fact that we're going to die and the fact that we know we are going to die throughout our lives affects everything that we do. The fact that we have religion, the fact that we build buildings, the fact that we want to have children and create businesses and become writers is because we know we have this deadline on our lives. And the more that we celebrate that and engage with that, the more self-aware our culture is going to be. So when I talk about sitting with the body, when I talk about engaging with death, when I talk about having rituals, it's not because, for me personally, I believe that the person is still there, or that something is happening, or that they're aware that I'm doing this for them from some, watching me from above. Because I don't really believe that, although many people do. Even though I don't believe that, I believe that the fact that I work with death and that I work with dead bodies makes me personally a more self-aware person. And I know the darkest parts of life and the darkest parts of reality because I work with the dead. And I also know the most beautiful parts of reality. And so my contention is that when you continue to have a relationship with death, especially through the physical form of the dead body or imagining yourself as dead, that you become a smarter, more self-aware, more engaged person with reality and with your community and with the universe around you. And I'm sorry I can't go further into it, but that's an interesting question, and the way you posed it is really interesting. But I still love a corpse, I gotta say. Still love a corpse, still love hanging out with a corpse, and even in a secular way, it's incredibly beautiful to see the change that happens with people when they just sit with their own dead. Even though they know they're gone, that's kind of the point, as she was saying earlier, that's kind of the point. You get to see them be gone. You get to see the little changes happening, you get to see the stillness, you get to see them get a little colder, and you're like, wow, that's right, this person really is not here anymore. And that's an incredibly powerful moment, and I wish more people were able to have it, frankly. And that's it. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming. Cheers, Chicago.